Hi friends! This week I'm gonna do another kids craft. I know I've been doing a lot of craft kits lately, but I have a lot of them. I just want to try every craft I see, so it's always like, I'll take one of those, and one of that, and one of those. So this is a yarn llama kit. I don't really know what a yarn llama is, but we're about to find out. Here's what's inside of the kit. And based on this picture, I just have this sneaking suspicion that we might be wrapping the yarn around the cardboard. After flipping through the instructions, I've decided that after I make the llama from the kit, I want to see if I can make my own animal. That'll be fun. The llama kit actually took an insanely long time to do, so I'm going to try and breeze through it and go a little more in depth when I do my animal. I'll post that timestamp here. I mean, I hope you stick around, because if I suffered through it, you can too. But I'll understand if you don't. Still here? You are always my favorite. So the first thing that we need to do is attach all of the cardboard cutout pieces together to make a sort of 3D llama. They give you double-sided tape for this, which is honestly kind of a pain to work with. Trying to peel the backing off was not easy. Ignore the fact that I accidentally put tape on the last layer of cardboard. I just got too excited. That will fade. The picture in the instruction booklet doesn't match the diagram or the actual pieces in the kit, so that's cool. Next, I needed to wrap the feet. I struggled a little bit to keep the wrapping tight, but also to cover all of the cardboard. So I added a little bit of glue, actually a lot of bit of glue, to help. After his little boot was wrapped, I secured the end with double-sided tape. The instructions said to do this. I didn't make that weird choice on my own. Finally, when all 4 feet were done and the glue was dry, it was time to do the thighs. This was much easier since there's no weird angles to deal with. And there's something so satisfying about the yarn lining up perfectly with each wrap like that. Let me just make sure he can stand up on his own. Yep, those thick gams are sturdy. Then I wrapped his body horizontally and vertically over his booty and abdomen. Abdomen makes me think of a bug. What else do you call it? His trunk? His gut? Midsection? Actually, midsection is pretty good. To wrap his head, the instructions suggested wrapping a bunch of double-sided tape around his nose, but that seemed weird, so I used glue instead. First I wrapped horizontally, then I wrapped around the very tip of his muzzle and backwards towards his face. I basically coated this in glue and held it with rubber bands until it dried. After that, I worked my way backwards over his head, down his neck, and over his chest. I just tied this in a knot and glued it down, because he's going to have a blanket to cover most of his body. To make the tail, I wrapped a bunch of yarn around my fingers. I tied one end together by sticking string through the loop and knotting it. Then I cut the loops on the other end. I separated the threads to make them fluffy and curly. Halfway through, I got bored and tied it around his back end. Then I shoved the string up where the sun don't shine.
Hey!
Ooh, that looks uncomfortable.
Don't worry, this was purely consensual. Then I finished separating the threads and gave it a little trim. I repeated the process for the little tuft of hair on his head. He got some felt ears and eyes glued on, and then I rubber banded those to dry. To make this rain rope thing, I'm going to finger crochet, which is something that I've never actually heard of, but was pretty easy to do. It basically involved making a loop and pulling the tail through. I'll put a link in the description in case you'd like to see how it's done. I found this really awkward to do since I'm left-handed, and the instructions are, I'm sure, written for someone right-handed. That's also the reason I've struggled to learn how to crochet with a hook. What the is that noise? Is that seagulls? Why are there seagulls? I made a little nose-sized loop and then put it on my buddy and tied it really loosely around his neck. Then I finger crocheted a shorter version. Crochet, crochet, crochet. And that one goes around his head and gets tied to the nose loop thingy. This is all very cute, but we still have a long way to go. Next, we have to make his blanket. We have some felt pieces to stick together. Again, they suggested double-sided tape for this, but for the life of me, I could not get the tape to separate from the backing. And the tape was actually super sticky to the felt, and I felt like I was going to rip it when I tried to pull it off. I almost stabbed my desk. I was so frustrated. I did finally end up ripping the tape off and just having to deal with a wonky piece of felt. I just coated this in glue and jammed that second piece on. Next, we have to make fringe. I cut 50 strands of orange and pink yarn. 50! Then, alternating colors, I tied them around a long piece of yarn in a lark's head knot. I needlessly went and tightened each knot, and then I glued the fringe on around the edge. Of course, the measurements weren't right, so I had to add extra strands of fringe at the end, and then a last little trim. I glued on the blue centerpiece. I tried a different kind of glue on the blanket, so hopefully it dries clear like the school glue does. Next, let's play with some balls. And by that, I mean use tweezers to glue teeny tiny, easy to drop puff balls evenly spaced around the blanket. Finally, I glued the blanket and a little belly strap onto the llama. By this time, I was too tired of working on this to find a big rubber band, and I just rage tied this string around him for the glue to dry. Are we done yet? No! We've still got 8 million tassels to go. It's actually only 5, but I'm still bitter. We're going to start by taking a ton of tiny strands of thread and tying them together down the middle. Then we're going to give it a belt, but it's more towards the top, so it's like a neck belt. Wait, that's a choker. After it's sufficiently choked, we're going to trim its feet. That analogy is dumb. Then we're going to make a second one exactly like the first, and then make 2 more in different colors. And then make a final tiny fluffy one. And also glue more balls onto it. Last, we're going to free the llama from his bondage and truss him up. He gets tassels tied to his reins and nose thingy, and one glued behind his ear. I don't really understand the placement of this. Is it supposed to be an earring? A body modification? Is it like when teenage girls get their hair wrapped? Finally, he's done, and I've never been so happy to have finished a project. What an insanely involved process. He's really cute and all, but dang, I could have grown a real-life llama in less time than I spent making this one. Now on to making an animal of my own. When thinking about what animal to choose, I figured it had to be something with appendages that stuck out away from its body, so not like a bunny or a frog, and I needed to be able to wrap it in a way that all the cardboard was covered, so not my favorite dinosaur. I went with a lion, figuring I could add his mane later with fringy yarn. I used the diagram for the llama to figure out what layers I needed for the lion. I did 3 inside layers with just the head, body, and tail, leaving off the legs. 2 layers with the head, body, and legs, no tail. Then 4 layers, 2 for each side, with just the body and legs, making the body a little smaller each time. To cut all 9 layers out, I used a combination of scissors and an X-Acto knife. I used double-sided tape again because it actually worked pretty well to hold the pieces together without waiting for the glue to dry. Also, the bond doesn't have to be super strong because everything is going to get wrapped together 8,000 times. Once he was put together, he seemed a little skinny, and like his legs were real close together. So I maybe could have added 1 more middle layer if I was doing this again. I bought my own yarn for this, and I didn't try that hard to find specific colors. I just got whatever was cheap and close enough. I started with a dark brown around his little footsies. When I started thinking about it, lions' feet are the same color as their bodies, so this doesn't really make a lot of sense. Maybe he walked through mud. Also, I used my glue method again for this, and I struggled even more than I did with the llama. What is that? I ended up taking it off and trying again, and I basically encased the foot in a gluey yarn cement. I did eventually figure out a better way, but you'll have to wait a little later for that. While that was drying, I made a little puffy tail for him. I used the same method as before, wrapping thread around my fingers, tying it together at one end, and cutting the other end. Then I separated the threads to make it fluffy. To attach the tail, I decided to tape the long strings to the cardboard and cover it with wrapping. As I wrapped, the thread kept sort of pushing the puffy part further and further away, and not really going up the tail towards the body. So here's where I discovered that maybe that kit knew what it was talking about. I wrapped a piece of double-sided tape around the cardboard, and what do you know? The yarn stuck to it and stopped trying to slip off the end. That would have worked great for the feet. I also, just at this point, realized that you can just layer up on the curves where the yarn wants to separate. Then you don't have to worry as much about coverage. Once I wrapped as close to his booty as I could fit the yarn in, I taped the end to the cardboard. Next, I wrapped his legs. These were pretty straightforward, except that they were a little bit closer together than the llama's, so it was just a bit more awkward getting yarn in there. After all 4 legs were done, it was time for the body. My plan of attack was to start just above the legs, wrap under the tail as far as I could, then wrap over his tail until I got to where his butt starts to curve. I wasn't as super concerned with covering the pooch of the belly or the middle because I knew I was just going to cover it up with the next step. I wrapped from the inner back thigh crotchular area back over the butt hump, and I made my way up his back and wrapped until I ran into his front legs. I checked his sturdiness, and he's a little narrow to stand on his own, so I just gave him a little bit of physical therapy and bent the cardboard underneath. For his nose, I did what I should have done in the first place, and following the kit instructions, covered the whole dang thing in double-sided tape. It was a pain to get the backing off the tape, but way less of a pain to try and wrap the nose and coat it in glue. It was honestly a breeze to wrap and stick the yarn to the tape and not worry about it slipping off. After I wrapped horizontally, I wrapped around the muzzle and worked my way back along the head. I was so happy with the tape trick that I used it on the top of the head too. After I made my way down the neck, I glued the end down under the belly. There's no way I am making any sort of blanket or adornment for this guy, so I didn't want the thread showing on the side of him. And I learned to stick with school glue if I want it to look seamless. For his facial features, I got some black felt. I cut out a couple of eyes, tested them out,
Good enough.
and glued them on. A little triangle for a nose. He looks a little derpy so far. Maybe this will help. I made him a fluffy mane with orange and red yarn, the same way I made that ruffle on the blanket. I originally started with shorter strands, but then I decided I wanted him to have a much bigger mane, and also partly disguise the fact that I forgot to get felt for ears. I finished the other end with short strands to make it even on both sides. I tied this around his head and then used glue to stick it on. I used tacky glue for this because I don't expect this to show, and I wanted a really good bond. Then, because I didn't feel like cutting tiny parts out of felt, I used fabric paint to paint on his mouth and little highlights in his eyes. And he's done. He still needs a little bit of recurring leg bending to help him stand on his own, and he probably could really use some ears, but I don't think he's half bad for using my own materials. What do you think? Is anyone still here after all of that? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.